Thanks very much, Siobhan. And going to Rushanara, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. I'm going to start off with some questions on a just transition. And we've heard quite a lot about costs from questions that other colleagues have asked of trying to reach the net zero target. Perhaps Kemi and John, you could both speak to where you see in financial terms the benefits are of taking action from now on into both short-term, medium and longer-term action in terms of costs that will be mitigated to our country if we act now to reduce carbon emissions and work towards reaching the 2050 target. Kemi, do you want to start? And it would be really helpful if we could have some hard facts if you've got them, or if you want to signpost us to stuff that is coming out imminently and when imminent is.
So the question we're asking is, what are the benefits of acting now rather than waiting? And I think it goes without saying that with anything that's going to cost a lot of money, the sooner you start, the more you can get done given the deadline and given the time frame. What I don't have for you are exact amounts for how quickly, how much benefit you're going to get if you start this year or if you start next year and so on. There will be some things that might get cheaper to do in time, but the certainty around it isn't clear. So we don't, for instance, know exactly what technological improvements are going to come between now and 2050, and we can't make the decision just to hope the technology fixes all of the problems. So starting now gives us as much time as possible in terms of getting a net zero economy and a net zero society that is sustainable, and also gives people time to prepare, gives people time to adjust and time to transition. You said something about a just transition. I think I'm not actually sure what you meant by that.
Those are my questions are quite heavily focused on transition, so I'll come on to those. But if I can, perhaps Neva, would you be able to speak to, or even Richard, speak to any both domestic and international experience of where you think costs can be reduced? For instance, the damage that's being done by rising numbers of floods in our country is costing a lot of money annually. Is the Treasury doing work in terms of identifying where risks are growing because of climate risks, and what is going to be what kind of revenue is going to be saved through action? Is there any data on that, UK specific, or other examples of what other countries are doing?
So in the UK, the OBR produce a fiscal risks report that look at a lot of medium-term risks. They, for the first time, published a chapter on climate change last year, and in it they identified different types of risks, both climate change mitigation as well as climate change adaptation. The Net Zero Review is looking specifically at climate change mitigation and the optimal path to get to net zero by 2050. So as part of that, we're looking at distributional issues, as the Minister said earlier, and a just transition is very much, part and parcel of that.
Yeah, so we should expect to see some facts on what sort of costs as well as benefits of action there would be, as opposed to, because it does feel like sometimes the debate, certainly in the last, in this conversation so far, in this hearing as well, has been focused on what is going to cost us to reduce emissions, as opposed to what are the benefits to society.
I think so an example
in the future when your reviews come out. Yeah.
I think an example of why it's easier to look at costs in terms of benefits is because it also has to take into account what other people are doing. So, for instance, there could be economic opportunities, and that's certainly the plan that we have in the Treasury, that we will have a comparative advantage in key areas like R&D and so on. But to be able to quantify that also means knowing what other people are going to do and how much they're going to invest, and that requires sort of looking into the future. We can't do that. We can't predict exactly. We can only make a plan.
With respect, there are some things where we can already see the risks and the costs. Flooding is a good example of that. So it would just be helpful. We'll move on to another topic perhaps, but it would be helpful to try and see more evidence of where the benefits are, because of course, as you rightly pointed out earlier, we're expecting to invest a lot to reach the target, and colleagues have spoken to costs to the taxpayer of that, and to build an alliance with citizens, it needs to be made clear where the benefits are. Energy costs can be reduced towards transitioning, for instance. Those are the benefits, alongside some other costs that will need to be mitigated in terms of those who bear the higher costs if we're having to transition from dirty energy to clean energy, etc. That's what I was looking for.
Okay.
It would be John. John had his hand up. Sorry.
Let Kemi finish, and I'll go on then. Yeah.
I think what would be helpful is at the point when the interim report comes out, that's the sort of feedback that could help us in sort of determining, are we going in the right direction? And if there isn't enough in terms of those sorts of things, I think we could look to see what more information could be provided. I think that you will see what you're looking for in there, but it's one of the reasons why we do an interim report, exactly for the reason that you point out, that the information we provide might be what we think people want, but might not necessarily be enough to answer the questions that they have.
Thank you. I'm just going to add on one more if you want to pick up on this. Earlier on, obviously, there have been questions about the investment that's gone in, particularly around COVID. Are you both satisfied that the investment, that has been put in terms of the focus on green jobs, for instance, in terms of trying to protect jobs, as you've said, as well as to try and look to the future at how we reduce emissions by focusing on particular sectors? Do you feel that what the government has done is adequate, or is there more that could be done, given the crisis at hand and the amount of money that's being spent to try and protect jobs and protect livelihoods?
Well, I'm happy to come in on this one. And if I just reference the previous discussion, this quantification of risks and costs, I mean, you rightly point out the opportunities of making interventions when we can see the catastrophic cost of not doing so. Yep. But the whole issue around the climate-related financial disclosures, TCFD, is actually about bringing a common understanding of what those costs are. At the moment, what I see across businesses who face different costs is a real challenge to quantify that. Yep. But in terms of your question just then, with respect to the interventions, I mean, Kemi will talk to the specific ones in the green space. But I mean, I think we've got to get the balance here between what we were trying to do in emergency situation, and for many businesses, that there wasn't going to be a green element to it. Now, the home insulation and the work on the public estate and things that could move the dial in terms of protecting jobs in the short term was a key driver of that. But that's only one part of a much larger set of interventions that we're making, and we will, announce more. But I shall pass back to Kemi because I think she will have more to say on this.
Thank you, Kemi.
Thank you, John. I think what I would say is that it's an ongoing task, and with every announcement, there's more information that we can use to work out what the right interventions are to make. So, for instance, with the Green Homes Grant, for instance, we've put in 2 billion into that. It's 3 billion in the round in terms of decarbonisation, but we also need to look at things like, can the jobs market absorb the money that's going in? It's money is just one lever. Simply adding more and more money into one particular thing doesn't mean that there's going to be the capacity to actually get the things done. If you have, for instance, an industry where people aren't able to work very much because of COVID, simply adding much more money into it doesn't mean that you're going to create the jobs. The law of diminishing returns will come in when it comes to financing things. We need to look at lots of different ways of stimulating a COVID recovery and a green recovery. And I think I mentioned this in relation to a previous question. The spending is only one aspect. Taxing in terms of getting people to change behavior, regulation. Those are all things that we need to do in terms of getting to net zero. And we should use COVID very, very carefully when we look at those sorts of elements. If I look at the airline industry, for example, which is one that's having a difficult time within COVID, how do we have a green recovery within the airline industry? There are some people who argue that industry is one that's just carbon emitting. Are we going to say, goodbye to all those jobs, which means that we might hit one target on net zero, but destroy another in terms of employment, and vice versa. So it's something that we consider at every step and with every announcement, but it isn't as simple as just putting more into any particular area.
I'm not suggesting it is, but the government's response has informed significant amounts of public expenditure because of the crisis. So it's an opportunity.
Absolutely.
And so in that context, you've already spoken to the fact that there are even more employees whose jobs are at risk, and the transition, airlines are a good example, where it's likely that in the future, even with a vaccine, air travel will for a period be much, perhaps a lot less than it has been. And of course, the other sectors that that are well known to us, that where people will need to transition. So are you satisfied, both Kemi and John, are you satisfied that there is a credible plan in government, working across government, to make sure that we don't have the effect on some, we don't have a kind of winners and losers situation where the transition towards greening leads to poorer people or those who are in heavy carbon emission sectors end up being hit very hard? Is there detailed granular work being done to protect those people so that we can make sure that the journey towards 2050 is one that is genuinely just, rather than having significant numbers of losers, and the state actually doesn't do enough to help them? Do you feel that you're doing enough work across government? And if not, what else do you see yourselves doing to make sure that happens?
I certainly think that we're doing everything we can. Whether everything we can is enough is a completely different question. And with many of these things, we can only act based on the information that we have available at a specific time. So we're talking about, for instance, a scenario where we didn't know for sure whether we'd be having future lockdowns. We didn't know anything about the tiered system. We don't know what the situation is going to be this time next year. So we're operating in an environment that's very, very dynamic. In that perspective, from that perspective, yes, we are doing everything we can. In fact, I would be worried if we had so many specific plans when there was so much uncertainty. I think what we need to be able to do is to be able to respond quickly to a changing situation. And if you look at the interventions and the schemes that have come through, it's the quick response and making sure that people don't feel a negative impact immediately.
Thank you, Kemi. That's really helpful in terms of dealing with the immediate. In terms of the longer term, because obviously there's a longer term agenda that needs to be looked at in terms of transition and, again, winners and losers. Is there any work, John, around how that is managed, because that's going to be a constant issue? And in terms of the work of in terms of the financial services sector, 15% of the city has financed about 15% of global CO2 emissions. Can you say a bit about what the Treasury, along with other departments, is doing, but particularly Treasury, in terms of trying to bear down on those numbers so that we can really see the city acting as a responsible sector and responsible investor?
Yes, I'll take you back, if I may, to the green finance strategy and the elements within it, which are seeking to change the overall operating environment for measuring and reporting the risks around climate, and actually raising standards of understanding across, correct myself earlier, the 12 institutes that drive the sort of professional behaviours in the city. But what you're, I think, driving at is almost the distributional impact of macroeconomic change and interventions with respect to climate change how do we make sure that what effect we have is positive across the whole of the distribution of wealth across this country? That is, is not the drive. The challenge is to achieve our aspirations and goals by 2050, which is in legislation. But we also are sensitized through all the interventions we make to the effect it has on people. And as has been mentioned previously in the session, the OBR does that distributional analysis, which underscores the decisions we make, and that's on the record. So there is an inbuilt sensitization to that.
My question was about 15% global CO2 emissions by the city. You've got an opportunity with COP26 next year. We're going to have the whole world coming together to think about how each country takes action.
Yeah.
Our emission rate is very high. You're a finance minister, along with your colleague here. You do have power over and influence over the city.
Yeah.
What do you see yourself doing in terms of mobilizing and pressure that is appropriate pressure and regulation? You were asked the question about the FCA and others, to try and bring down those numbers over the medium to long term. And I think it's okay and easy to talk about 2050 and not take action incrementally. And we need to see a plan, because it's not acceptable for the city to be investing in dirty energy and financing for global CO2 emissions on the one hand, while we host a summit trying to bring down global carbon emissions, because that's not leading by example.
What I've tried to say to you is that through the work that we're doing, the work that Mark Carney's doing, the work that we're doing, and we will be joining the International Platform for Sustainable Finance, which is a multilateral body that we intend to join. We're looking for common standards on taxonomy internationally, so that we can understand the levels of risks and therefore make decisions and interventions in terms of expectations of reporting to drive and change behaviours. This won't be, can I just finish, please? This won't be achieved by one single intervention. It's a changing of fundamental reporting structure within the city and financial institutions, and we're very engaged at many levels on doing that. And I've set out several aspects of that this afternoon.
Yes, and what I'm asking is, do you feel confident? Are you confident that you'd be able to, as we get to the summit, COP26 summit next year, that we'd be able to signpost the direction of travel and how we reduce the 15% to something a lot less over a period of time? Because you can have quite a lot of interventions, as you've described, on measurement and so on, all of which are very important, heading that way. But it would be helpful to get some sense of whether we should expect to be able to get a line of sight in terms of how that number is going to be brought down. That was my question.
Okay, I can't tell you what the number is going to be next year or the year after, but I can tell you that I think it's pretty clear that we're straining every sinew to examine every aspect of reporting of the conduct of the city, of the reporting of climate across institutions of different sizes, to try and work multilaterally to actually achieve something very significant, both for the short, medium and long term, in a way that's sustainable for our economy and explains the trade-offs that we've made along the way. And that's absolutely our aspiration as we move into COP26 chair in 12 months from now.
Okay, thank you. And I've just got one more, which is about EU exit. And at that point, we are no longer going to benefit from the European Investment Bank. Where are we in terms of the prospect of establishing a new green infrastructure bank?
I think that'd probably be one for Kemi.
I can't speak to a green infrastructure bank. I can speak to the National Infrastructure Strategy, and that it will be looking at various things that will cover that, including financing opportunities and so on. I think that might be what you're alluding to, rather than specifically a green infrastructure bank.
You don't propose establishing something akin to an infrastructure bank?
As far as I'm aware, the National Infrastructure Strategy is going to set out sort of financing options. So that's where I would look. And if it is going to have a green infrastructure bank, then we'd have to wait for that announcement.
Okay, thank you.